I would try to talk quite broadly about a combination of what's going on today, particularly for NASA, with astrobiology and human space exploration, but then to ask this strange-sounding question, are we the ultimate astrobiological experiment? And I will come back to that a few slides down to expand on it and think very much about the future, not just the immediate future, but the much deeper future, which hopefully will be at least fun for you to think about. So I wanted to begin by just reminding us, at least for those of you who are not intimately familiar with how NASA does things, what we mean when we say astrobiology, because I understand that the word astrobiology sometimes gets slightly different use depending on where you are. But for NASA, astrobiology is very much the study of the origin, evolution, and distribution of life in the universe. And that means answering questions like, how does life begin and evolve? Does life exist elsewhere in the universe? And how do we search for life in the universe? And today, at the moment, most of that search within our own solar system, of course, we're also looking much further afield by beginning to chart out the population of exoplanets and looking for Earth analog worlds that might harbor life and so on with our large space telescopes like James Webb and so on. But within our solar system, the current search for life or evidence of life elsewhere is robotic. So I thought I'd just remind us of some of what's going on. We've heard about quite a lot of this already in the last 2 days, but just to step through this and tell you about something new as well. So we're all familiar with rovers like Perseverance and Curiosity and their predecessors, Spirit and Opportunity, on Mars, and a rover like Perseverance is a mobile laboratory, and part of its laboratory equipment is engaged in evaluating the environment on the surface of Mars, and in particular the prevalence or lack of organics and other compounds that might be indicative of past or conceivably even present situations where life could exist. So we're probably familiar with Perseverance. We know that coming down the line, we hope, from ESA will be the Franklin rover and its mobile laboratory, which is perhaps even more focused towards astrobiology in terms of the instrumentation that it will carry, and it will also, we hope, carry a drill, which will enable drilling and looking at samples in the immediate subsurface of Mars, which may be more protected from the immediate surface chemistry and the surface radiation environment. And right now, although I have to be cautious how I say this because there isn't a plan per se, but on the horizon, perhaps into the 2030s, is the question of whether or not NASA will send, and we hope we will, a medium-class robotic mission to Mars that is explicitly a life search mission, or a search for life mission. We love our acronym, so SFL is the current acronym for this search for life mission. So this illustration is actually not necessarily anything like what this will look like. This illustration is actually of an idea called the Mars Life Explorer, which was kind of a straw man model for a mission that was incorporated into the US Decadal Review. So if you're not familiar with this, roughly every 10 years in the US, for science like planetary science and astrobiology, there's an enormous community review that results in a survey and a document that kind of lays out what we think the priorities for our planetary science and astrobiology should be in the coming decade. And part of that was this idea for what was called a Mars Life Explorer, and we're now calling a search for life mission. So the idea is that hopefully prior to humans getting to Mars, we want to send at least one more robotic mission explicitly designed to look for evidence of life on Mars. And this is a medium-class mission, so it'd be roughly a $2 billion mission. Now, the question is, where should it go and what exactly should it do? So I'm currently chairing a science analysis group which consists of about 20 people. It's an international group that we've put together. We really only started our work about 2 months ago to really take a good hard look at the options and to take a good hard look at how we would make this a true astrobiology mission. So I'll say something which I probably shouldn't as a NASA employee, but often planetary science attaches the label of astrobiology to what it does, especially on Mars, when strictly speaking, it's more about planetary science or geophysics or you know, planetary evolution than it is explicitly about astrobiology. So our charter is to decide or not to decide to evaluate the possibilities for looking for extant life on Mars as a priority. That could include looking for evidence of extinct life, but explicitly looking for extant life is a priority. So right now we're considering something that would land in mid-latitudes on Mars, where there's potentially surface or near-surface ice. That seems like a prime environment to explore, and we're in the midst of sifting through all the options for the phenomena that we would want to look for if we want to make as definitive a statement about the presence or absence of extant life as possible. How we would do that right now for a $2 billion class mission, it's probably stationary, but maybe not. Maybe it needs to be a mobile platform to do this. Anyway, I wanted to mention it because it's on the horizon. We will be producing a report sometime hopefully this year, and that will go out to the community for community feedback, and then we'll see where we go with the next steps for this. So that's on the horizon, but I would claim, just like the planetary scientists claim that they are astrobiology missions. I'm an astrobiologist, I'll claim these planetary science missions are astrobiology missions. Missions like Europa Clipper and JUICE that we heard about yesterday in Frank's wonderful talk are going to provide data that absolutely feeds into our astrobiological exploration of the solar system in terms of understanding these environments that may exist beneath the icy crusts of places like Europa or Ganymede or Enceladus and so on. And I would say even Dragonfly, going to Titan, has elements in its science portfolio that will contribute directly to our exploration where we're looking for life in the solar system. All of this is ongoing, but all of this is robotic. So what happens if we, as we think we're going to move into an era of extensive human exploration, starting with the moon to Mars? And so this is where I put my NASA hat on a little bit and sort of give the party line, so to speak. But you know, the interesting thing for me, and I've come into this fairly recently, I've only worked for NASA for 2 years. Prior to that, I was at Columbia University. So coming into this, it has really struck me how science is deeply, deeply integrated into everything that is being currently planned for human exploration by NASA and by everyone who's involved in Artemis, which now consists of at least 40 countries have signed the Artemis Accords. And Artemis is the new lunar exploration piece of this, but it is all part of this larger architecture, which is Moon to Mars. So it's learning how to support humans, to find resources, to do things on the moon as a type of stepping stone towards eventually sending humans to Mars. And the Moon to Mars architecture, you can look at it for yourself. There's a web link down here, or if you just Google it, there's extensive literature. So much literature that you'll fall asleep before you've even turned the second page. This is the way of things at NASA. But what you'll see in that literature, in that architecture overview, is that it's science, 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 science all the way down. So it's lunar and planetary science, heliophysics is in there, human and biological science, even physics, and also the emphasis is on doing things that enable science and enable opportunities for science. So we don't know necessarily what science might be possible, but to make sure that things are in place to make it as easy as possible to do science. So I'll say a little bit about this. This is a little bit dry, and then I'll get into some more interesting things. But just, again, if you dig into what we currently have as the architecture for Moon to Mars, which is extremely complex, right? One of the things I've learned is that if you want to send humans in any coherent, systematic, and safe way to places like the Moon and Mars, and to do more than what Apollo did, it takes an awful lot of moving parts to make that all work. But deeply embedded in this, again, are science objectives. Please don't read this as just very boring text, but I put it here to reinforce the notion that again and again throughout the Moon to Mars architecture, science and the opportunity for science is being considered, being integrated into everything that we're doing. So if I just highlight in green here, places where phrases like transformational science, retrieve core samples, volatile bearing sites on Mars, return representative samples, lunar and Martian surface, maximize science return, and so on and so on and so on. It is an endless part of the conversation. And I want to say that because I want to reassure you that when we're talking about sending humans into the solar system, sure, there are all sorts of geopolitical things going on with that, lots of posturing. But for the people actually putting it together, we're talking about science and how to do science, how to help humans do science, how to help robots do science, and so on. So the interesting thing is that as you look at this and consider it, what you realize is that very many scientific needs are often exactly the same as human exploration needs. And that's really exciting because I think if this all goes ahead as planned, we're going to find ourselves in a future where there are immense new scientific opportunities across the solar system for astrobiology, but other aspects of science as well. So for human exploration, you need high-mass launch and landing systems. Well, that's a great way to take all the equipment you want with you to interesting places. And that means you can take equipment that does not have to be flight ready in the way that it does now for robotic missions. You can take a much larger, more complex, more sensitive mass spectrometer with you. You can take more of a terrestrial type laboratory with you if you have the capacity to take a lot of mass to elsewhere in the solar system. For humans, you also need habitats and you need sophisticated life support systems and you need power to drive all of those. Well, that means for science, you get to have environmentally controlled facilities and laboratories on the Moon, on Mars. You need mobility and you need a duration of mission suitable for humans, depending on orbital parameters for places like Mars and so on. But that means you get to transport scientists around. You don't have to just sit in your module on the surface of Mars. You say, well, actually, today we need to go 20 kilometers out there to this really interesting outcrop where we're going to do some sampling and experiments. And it lets you deploy instruments in a way that is challenging even with the best robotic explorers that we have today. Communications and data, this is something that often gets overlooked, but think about how we all do science here. Right? I'm constantly checking my Google file space, my Google Drive, and the asynchronous work that I do with other colleagues all the time, and uploading my data and running my code and so on. Well, you know, human exploration requires all of that as well. So we're going to be building this technological infrastructure, cloud systems, cloud storage systems for scientific data logging and collaboration. Right? Why not collaborate with a scientist who's currently stationed on the Moon or Mars? Right? It's just like to me, it's like being in this time zone versus the time zone in the US and logging on and doing my work. My colleagues are not there in real time, but it's pretty close. And the same will be true for human exploration and science. Planetary protection, which is of course extremely important for human exploration, both to ensure the safety of human astronauts, but also to ensure that we don't unduly mess up the environments we're exploring. That capacity and the development of approaches to human exploration that support that will also support things like the preservation of unique and indigenous samples and environments that we desperately want to preserve for science. And of course, advanced robotics and telerobotics. There's no part of Moon to Mars as currently being envisaged that does not incorporate a lot of robotics and telerobotics, so human-operated robotics. And of course, for science, that means you can do more interesting sampling and exploring and even autonomous science. Okay, so there endeth the sort of NASA preaching for a little bit, and I'll talk about some slightly different stuff now. So I would say that I'm a bit of a convert to the idea that the search for extraterrestrial life is arguably the single most compelling scientific question that the future of human exploration in the solar system can engage with. And it is being baked in at the outset, certainly for NASA, in the whole architecture that we're talking about, whether it's floating laboratories in the upper atmosphere of Venus, or whether it's astronauts on the surface of Mars. And that's really exciting. But the other interesting thing here is that astrobiology really does inform the future of humans in space. This is where I'm trying to respond to sort of the description of this session, the description of this symposium as well, thinking about humanity and space. So, astrobiology is a lot about developing a very deep knowledge of terrestrial biology to understand the phenomena involved in terrestrial biology so that we might look for those types of phenomena elsewhere, and especially the traits of extremophilic life. Of course, here it's mostly microbial. So I'm not talking about terrestrial biology as in us, per se, but even this has direct relevance for humans in space, for human exploration, because it speaks to where terrestrial life might persist and how terrestrial life might adapt itself or find itself having to adapt to deal with different environments. And that's also related to the study of biosignatures, right, which is a big piece of modern astrobiology. So the features of extant and extinct life that imprint and modify environments. And this is going to be important. It's also, I guess, related to planetary protection, but it's also distinct from planetary protection. It's really asking the question of, as we explore the solar system, what do we do to the solar system? Not necessarily in any overtly detrimental way, but just inevitably. We change the features, the imprints on the world around us. What does that mean? And what does that return to us? If we modify an environment on Mars and then we try to inhabit that environment, what's the result? It's not as simple as just going to Mars or making Mars look like the Earth and so on. Planetary protection is also extremely important, and that is informed by our understanding of terrestrial biology and our understanding of biosignatures. They're all part and parcel of the same thing. Astrobiology also talks about the response and robustness of terrestrial life to conditions in space and other planetary environments. Right? We're constantly thinking about how organisms might function in an environment like inside an icy moon, or in the subsurface of Mars, or even on a distant exoplanet. What are the biochemical strategies that life might employ in those conditions, and so on. And that's going to be very important for understanding what will happen to us and all the life that we inevitably carry with us as we explore the solar system. And astrobiology already has some understanding of this. And I also think there's a lot to be learned from astrobiology in terms of the dynamics of living systems and environments. Mars, for example, is a whole other planetary system with its own dynamics, its own climate dynamics, its own element cycling dynamics, and it's also about the resource use by organisms like humans, and even evolutionary processes. And a lot of energy has been expended in astrobiology to understand these things, because we want to understand the Earth system, we want to understand the history of life on Earth, but we also want to project that to places like exoplanets, as well as places like icy moon oceans and ancient Mars and so on. So we have a lot of the pieces that we need to help inform the future of humans in space. And even the origins of life and alternate pathways to living systems may help inform things about the future of humans in space, what to expect as we go into particular environments, okay, and what to look for as we go into particular environments. Our understanding of the origins of life, we would like to preserve prebiotic environments as much as we would like to preserve environments that have had or will have or already have extant life in them. So you need to understand what those environments look like, and so the origins of life work informs that too. Okay. So the really extraordinary thing is, I think, that right now the opportunity for terrestrial life to move beyond its planetary origins is clearly accelerating. right? You just have to look at the statistics of rocket launches and the statistics of space vehicles and devices that are being lofted into orbit around the Earth, but also sent much further afield, to see that things really are accelerating at the moment. At least that is my belief. And this is different than what happened in the 1960s. Okay, that was one of those sort of bursts of innovation that you kind of see in biological systems that then settle down to some sort of steady state. Now we're seeing a consistent exponential growth in launch, in resources being put into space exploration, and therefore inevitably the opportunity for terrestrial life to move beyond its planetary origins. So if I can be a little more philosophical about this, what's so interesting, I think, is that there's actually kind of a new facet to astrobiology emerging, or that will emerge in coming years, and that is, future astrobiology has to include the real-time study of life that is spreading from its point of origin. I don't think we've really spent a lot of time thinking about that before, right? Certainly in astrobiology, we're looking for evidence of life here or there. We're trying to understand the origins of life on Earth. We're not thinking real time. I believe that we will have to do that, and that will have to be an integral part of human exploration in the near future. And we have to ask about the inevitable impact of that expansion from point of origin on those organisms themselves, including us, including the rest of life on Earth and any other life in the solar system. So it's a new piece of astrobiology. I don't think it's quite ready to be a subfield within astrobiology, but it's definitely coming. And just to reinforce that, there's much more than just planetary protection or space biosciences, I think. It's about fundamental changes that are brought to the future trajectory of living systems that undergo a transition like this. Right? I mean, we really are undergoing a transition from planet-bound to not planet-bound. Now, it may be that much of what goes out there into the solar system is robotic, but that's a phenotype, right? It's an extension of us. And so we really want to understand what that means. What will it do to life that remains at the point of origin while part of it spreads out into the solar system? So now I'm sort of getting into the sort of hungover projection and extrapolation, but it's sort of fun to think about this. And again, I would argue that the core areas of astrobiology can provide insights to that trajectory. And I'll give you one example in the next slide. I think this is especially true when it comes to questions of the sustainability of life and exploration, and what we generally call in astrobiology the notion of habitability. I think this came up yesterday at some point in discussion. And what we want to understand about habitability changes, I would argue, when we or other species and other species extends itself from its point of origin. So let me give you an example of that. So I'll claim that the traditional notion of habitable zones, and I'll explain what that is in a minute if you're not directly familiar with it, which is something that we talk about all the time in astrobiology. Habitable zone is a physical demarcation of a zone in which life can be sustained, right? Possibly also where life can originate, but certainly where life can be sustained. And I'm going to argue that as we reach into this sort of future of humanity in space, that morphs from just sort of a demarcation of a physical zone into something more akin to a habitability landscape. So let me explain. So here's a silly picture of our solar system. Although the planets are more or less to scale, obviously their orbits are not to scale in this diagram. So in astrobiology, we spend a lot of time worrying about things like the circumstellar habitable zone. So that's the range of orbital distances from a star where if you take an Earth analog world and place it down with an Earth analog atmosphere where the surface conditions allow for the presence of liquid water. We use that as a kind of marker of potential habitability. And so you don't want to be too close to the star, you don't want to be too far away from the star. You need that sort of just right Goldilocks zone. But it's complicated because it depends on atmospheric composition and stellar type and so on. So that's a very common theme in astrobiology. And we all now also talk about a habitable zone that is really the interior ocean worlds. And in our own solar system, that's going to tend to happen further out in the solar system where the equilibrium temperatures, when an object is bathed in the electromagnetic radiation from the star, from the sun, where the equilibrium temperatures are below the sublimation temperature of water in a vacuum. But I would argue that this changes a bit in this future where we're part of the astrobiological experiment. And it changes because we're going to start to think about habitability in a more complex way. We're going to think about habitability in a very almost practical way, in this habitability landscape. So we're going to need to think more about things like solar storm risk. We're going to need to think about cosmic radiation risk. We're going to want to think about solar power availability, right, which obviously becomes more and more difficult as you get further away from the sun. But if we're exploring and spreading ourselves and other terrestrial life and robots out into the solar system, we also need to think about where the resources are. So there are asteroidal resources, but they tend to be concentrated in a certain region, at least within the inner solar system. We also need to think about ease of transport. And what I mean by that is ease of orbital transfer. Okay, getting from Earth to Mars requires a certain amount of energy. If you do it at certain times, it requires more energy. If you do it at other times, it requires less energy, and so on. And there are different strategies for getting from point A to point B in a planetary system, utilizing things like gravitational slingshots and so on. And so, there's a zone to do with ease of transport. There's a reason we're not talking about human exploration of Uranus or Venus, or of Neptune, or Venus too. And it's because of those orbital energetic constraints. So I think this is very interesting. This means that we're now seeing our own solar system and our own behavior as part of the astrobiological formula and as part of the sort of ongoing astrobiological experiment. And if you think about things this way, it immediately points, and I'll just put all these bullet points up because of time, it immediately points to areas of future advances in technology and science and of research, right? So we already talk about where the resources are and the nature of planetary environments. Well, we're really going to have to up our game on that in order to understand this habitability landscape. Where do we go for optimal resource availability? But also, how do we minimize our footprint and do science at the same time? We really don't want to make all the same mistakes that we apparently have made here on the Earth, right? And this is an opportunity to do things differently. And there may be a real motivation to do it properly this time because we simply can't afford to be as wasteful and as careless as we've been on the Earth, because space is hard, right? Space is difficult. And how to accommodate terrestrial life in these other zones. These are areas that are going to require much more work. There are innovations in orbital mechanics and propulsion to be made, right? It can seem like we know everything, right? Newton gave us the rules of orbital transition and so on, but actually, think about what we do today. We do things like we put space telescopes like the James Webb Space Telescope into a halo orbit around a point that contains no mass, right, around a Lagrange point. And there are other ways to move around in the solar system using things like weak instability theory to take you from one part of the solar system to another using a minimal amount of energy. It may take a long time, but you use a minimal amount of energy because you're actually exploiting the complex gravitational landscape of a planetary system. There's a lot more that we can do there. Our understanding of solar behavior, thank you, I'm almost done. Our understanding of solar behavior, we know a lot about the sun, but it's an ongoing process. And it's increasingly important as we send humans out into the solar system to really know what the sun is doing at any moment and what may happen during the course of a mission. And that, on a longer time scale, also involves understanding the interaction of the stellar atmosphere with the surrounding galactic atmosphere, the interstellar environment. And that changes over time, okay, as the sun and the solar system orbits around in the Milky Way galaxy. And then there are questions about the dynamics of multiplanetary life, right? We spend a lot of time, if you're an ecologist or environmental biologist, thinking about the dynamics of life within an environment on the Earth. But now we're talking about the potential dynamics of life spread across multiple places in a planetary system. What does that mean for the end point of population growth? What does it mean for economics? What does it mean for things like pathogen evolution, right? The new bird flu on Mars, is that going to be a problem here on Earth? Right? We'll have to think about things like that. If an astronaut starts to develop symptoms from some unknown virus when they're a long way from the Earth, what does that mean? What will it do to the rest of the planetary system? And then clearly, we're just in the midst of an enormous amount of development in robotic and algorithmic co-explorers. Okay, and so this is about autonomous science, where we have unsupervised and supervised systems, and I mean that both in the sense of the training of a machine learning model, but also the ability to send out a robotic avatar that maybe doesn't report back to us for a year. Then it comes and it's got a written up proposal because it used ChatGPT to take all of its data and turn it into a nice written up proposal or description of the science that it's done. There are many, many really interesting areas of future development. Okay, so my last slide is really sort of kicking it to a whole new level, but I thought, what the hell, it's the last day, let's think big, because in the end, understanding this habitability landscape, understanding what the Moon to Mars architecture is and what it leads to, understanding these other future opportunities and challenges like robotic and algorithmic co-explorers, all leads us to really be able to say more about what happens to life that goes beyond its point of origin. Okay? And then, so the obvious question is, do we learn from our own experience things that tell us about what may have happened elsewhere in the galaxy? Okay, and so this is where I'm really sort of reaching for the stars quite literally. What are the dynamics of species that occupy their planetary system and then go further? So this is actually just for fun. This is a simulation from a few years ago that we did. This is a model of our galaxy. Each sphere represents a few tens of millions of stars, and the changing colors represent settlement events for interstellar species as they propagate across this environment. And the reason we did this simulation was to try to understand how the actual motion of stars in our galaxy may play into the dynamics and statistics of interstellar settlement, interstellar spread. Obviously, entirely hypothetical. But you don't go to a star that's a long way away. You go to the star that's going to be nearest to you when you get there. That's what this simulation incorporates. And I just put it up there because it looks nice and it's sort of fun. But the point to make, my last point here, is that if we really treat the current ongoing evolution in space exploration as an astrobiological experiment, we may learn things about what happens in those circumstances that we could apply to elsewhere in our galaxy to understand why we do or don't see evidence of other life out there. And in this case, technological life, perhaps. And then in turn, our efforts to understand and look for technological life elsewhere in the universe will, of course, inform us about what has happened here, what is happening, and what may happen in the future. The news may not be good, but it's better to know than to not know. So on that not very optimistic note, I'll finish.